Hi, my name's Matt and I'd like to welcome you to this Zinniac video introducing sourcing options. We've got three names for organisations that supply us with services, products or services. Partner. A partner works closely to achieve common goals and objectives. Supplier does not have goals or objectives in common with us. And a vendor can be a partner or a supplier. So partner, supplier, vendor. Vendor is the generic term that covers partner and supplier. The key differentiator, as per the ITIL definition, is that a partner works closely to achieve common goals and objectives. The supplier doesn't have those in common with us. Worth remembering that for the exam. That could come up in the exam. So an example, a cloud services provider might supply infrastructure services to a consumer, but also partner with that consumer to implement tools that allow the customer to maximize its consumption of those services. So that's an example where a vendor is acting as both a partner and a supplier. So it can be, certainly for the exam, and within the syllabus, important to recognise the distinction between them. You may or may not make that distinction in your organisation. I've certainly worked in organisations where we have made the distinction between partners and suppliers, but whether there's been a very clear definition or not is another matter, but there you go. It is rare to create products and services using only existing resources. Yeah, so typically when we're creating products and services, we have some partners or suppliers, we have some vendors who are selling us some components, whether they are resources, products, services, to create our product and service. Organisations must decide whether to build or buy service components. That is, build, source them ourselves from our own resources, our own people, our own technology, or buy from third parties. And we'll have a whole video on build versus buy decision. Decisions should be made using data and evidence, considering factors such as the organisation's current and future sourcing needs, the current and estimated future costs of sourcing service components, the scarcity of resources in the ecosystem. So it might be that we'd like to build, but the scarcity of resources just means we can't afford to. We have to buy because that's the only way we can obtain the resources. And that's certainly been true for information security for many organisations over the last few years, that the scarcity of information security resources and their cost, and their, well, obviously supply and demand, because there's a scarcity of those resources, the cost goes up, and then many organisations were left unable to afford them as permanent staff, and therefore they had to go to third parties and effectively buy that as a service. The influence of competition, suppliers and customers, the barriers preventing new suppliers from emerging and those preventing existing suppliers from winding down, the costs and risks of sourcing components from an array of suppliers. And again, that's always a critical decision to make. Do we have one supplier who we can then have a very close relationship with and monitor their service, but they're not in direct competition? Or do we have multiple suppliers, whether that's 2, 3 or more? That means more relationships to manage, which is less efficient, but it does provide us with competition where we can basically go to supplier A and say you're not as good as supplier B, or to supplier B and say you're not as good as supplier A, and put your ideas up, or we'll just stick with one. And there's always that dynamic, but also thinking about what will they do if we move away from them. If we take our business away from supplier B, what will happen to supplier B? So it could be they'll go out of business, and we'll lose that option. So because we pick supplier A, they're now the only supplier, so we have no choice but to stick with them. So sometimes organisations like to keep two suppliers, so there's a risk mitigation factor. They're keeping two suppliers open, so they've got some options. Equally, one of the partner organisations I worked with looked at partners they were working with and went from 5 to 1. What did the other 4 do? They went off and created competitor products to that, which was being supplied through supplier A. So you can inadvertently create competitors to you if you remove suppliers. So it's not this straightforward decision. You have to think about this in the round again, take a holistic view. These considerations are used to form a sourcing strategy along with associated plans and models on how to source each type of service component. Which brings us to the end of this short video, which is just an introduction to sourcing options. So the next video we're going to go into build and buy in detail. We'll then look at sourcing options in detail in a further video, and then finally we will look at SIAM, service integration and asset management, in the final video in this series. I hope you've enjoyed this brief introduction. Please join me in the next video looking at build versus buy considerations. Until you see me again, have a great day.